With an iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max, switch to photo mode and tap the 1x button. Now you see it changes to 28mm from 24mm. So tap again to switch to 35mm. You can see that it zooms in each time and then it zooms back out again to go back to the 24mm. And these are what we call focal lengths. But the lens isn't actually changing. And so what's actually happening is that the iPhone is cropping in on the image. So whatever is set to here, you should actually get the same number of pixels and detail in the image. It's not actually quite the same as cropping in on your photos after you've taken them. So it's really just a way to easily and quickly reframe a photo. Missed it. Every year, Apple adds more camera features to the iPhone. And while it is really great to get these new features, it also makes the iPhone a little more complicated than the previous versions. The iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max have tons of features. I actually use iPhones to create video content professionally, so I don't really have any choice but to find out how everything works. So in this video, I'm just going to walk you through some tips and tricks for setting up your iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max for the best results when you're capturing photos and videos. Now, if we want, we can customize the different focal lengths that I just showed you. And we can also change the default camera, and we can remove the feature entirely. So just go into camera settings, scroll down a bit, and you'll see this setting called main camera. So just open that, and now you can toggle off the 28mm and the 35mm. And maybe you just want to switch between the 24 and the 35, for example. And you can also change the default camera. So if you find yourself using the 35mm crop the most, then just set it here as the default. So personally, I want to choose which camera my iPhone is using. But by default, your iPhone chooses this for you. And this can mean that you get an ugly change of camera in the middle of a shot. And the worst one is when it changes to the ultra wide for a macro shot. You're going to want to use the macro for getting an extreme close-up shot. Although I think we'd rarely use this for video, to be honest. And nearly always for photos. You know, the classic close-up of a bee sitting on a flower or something like that. But, you know, it's really annoying if it changes automatically, so let's stop it doing that. Firstly, scroll down and make sure macro control is toggled on. Swipe up to a setting called Preserve Settings, and now toggle on macro control here as well. This last setting means that the iPhone stick to whatever you last set your iPhone to do, either macro on or macro off. So open up your camera and move it close to an object. The first time you do this, you're going to see a yellow flower icon appear. With this icon yellow, your iPhone will automatically switch to the ultra-wide camera when it's close to an object. You see how the image moves as it switches between cameras? So that's not really going to look good if it's in the middle of a video take. And the other thing is that the ultra-wide is not as good quality as the main camera. So you just tap it and that switches it off. And now when you move close to an object, you're going to see this flower icon grayed out. But it's not going to change automatically to the ultra-wide until you tap that flower icon. We can also stop the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max switching to other cameras when recording video. So in camera settings, go into record video and then just swipe down and toggle on lock camera. So as you probably know, the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max have a 48 megapixel main sensor. But by default, they're going to shoot 24 megapixel photos. But you can also set them to shoot 48 or 12 megapixel photos. So in camera settings, go to formats and you'll see photo mode. Tap that to switch between 12 and 24 megapixels. Now below that you have ProRes and resolution control. So just switch that on. And now when you open the camera in photo mode, you're going to see a button for RAW Max. Tap it and you'll be taking 48 megapixel photos in the RAW format. And what is RAW? Well, it's basically an uncompressed format, and therefore the files are bigger. And they're actually over 10 times bigger than the regular photo files. In storage terms, each photo you take is like taking 10 photos. So, there's always a catch, isn't there, to higher quality. The main reason to capture photos in this uncompressed format is for a better editing experience, because you've got all that extra image information to work with. But you can also shoot 48 megapixel in the HEIF format, which creates much smaller files. So back in the ProRes menu, choose HEIF Max. And now you can get your 48 megapixel photos, but it's not going to fill up your phone's storage with these huge files. Now, unfortunately, you can't take portrait photos in these RAW formats. So if we switch to the portrait mode, you'll see there's no RAW button. And if we switch to the selfie camera, you can see RAW, and it's now at 12 megapixels rather than 48. And that's because the selfie camera has a 12 megapixel sensor. iPhones have this portrait mode, and unless you're completely new to iPhones, you will probably have used this mode already. The main thing it does is add a blurry background to mimic the look of a regular lens with a shallow depth of field. But you can actually add this effect afterwards. Tap Edit and then tap the F button. Now use the slider to add some background blur. And this white dot here gives you a bit of a reference. This is kind of like a recommended setting, but you can just play with it and get the result you want. And you can also use this yellow box. Just tap on the screen to choose the subject that you want to be in focus. So that's pretty useful if you have different subjects at different focal lengths and you want to make sure that one of them specifically is in focus. But bear in mind that this effect is not available with the 48 megapixel photos. Now there is a setting which I think often gets overlooked, but it does have the potential to trip you up if you don't understand it. So go into camera settings and formats. At the top we have this choice between high efficiency and most compatible. Now most of us have this switch to high efficiency, but this means that your photos are going to come out as HEIF files and your videos as HEVC files. And HEVC these days is usually fine for video, although I have had issues uploading it to YouTube, and so for that reason I usually master all my videos these days in H.264, which is the older, sort of more compatible format. But also you might find that these HEIF photos don't look as good as they do on your iPhone when you upload them to, say, something like Instagram. Also, you might have a similar issue with HDR Dolby Vision. In theory, Facebook and Instagram do support HDR. But if you do find that you're not really happy with how it looks after uploading, I suggest that you try uploading a non-HDR video and see if you get better results. Now let's look at video settings. But I do need to ask you a question. Do you mostly capture videos or photos? Personally, I'm someone who's nearly always capturing video with my iPhone. If you go into preserve settings again and then toggle on this setting called camera mode, because if you leave this off, whenever you open your camera app, it's always going to default back to the photo mode. But for me, I always want it to be in video mode, pretty much all the time. So if you're on a video shoot, you really don't want to have to keep switching back to the right mode every time you open the camera. And if you were using cinematic mode, it's going to return to cinematic mode as well. In fact, whatever mode you're using, it will just return back to it. And it's probably going to save you quite a bit of time. So this is another way to speed things up when we're capturing video. Back in the record video mode, choose the resolution and the frame rate you use most. So for me, this is 4K and 30 frames per second. So just tap the combination that works best for you, and you'll get this check mark beside it. So again, when you open your camera app in video mode, you're going to get these settings by default. Now, if you want to record slow motion, I don't actually switch to slow-mo mode because this restricts your video to 1080p resolution. Instead, I just tap the setting in the corner to switch to 60 frames per second. And then when I'm editing, I'm going to slow this 50% on a 30 frames per second timeline or down to 40% for a 24 frames per second timeline. So you might find this tip useful. A time saver is actually to shoot everything at 60 frames per second. So this means that you can decide whether you want a clip to be in slow motion when you're editing rather than when you're recording. So this gives you some more flexibility when you're editing, and as well it's going to save you time when you're recording video. Of course, it does take up more memory. It's going to take up basically twice as much memory as a 30 frames per second video. 10-bit color gives you far more color information to work with when color grading compared to the standard 8-bit color. So by default, your iPhone will be set to actually record 10-bit Dolby Vision. And this looks great in your iPhone because it supports the Dolby Vision color space, which basically adds this kind of extra dynamic range and brightness. The only problem is you might find that these video clips don't look right when you're viewing them outside your iPhone. So for example, you place it on a timeline when you're editing and it just looks overexposed. And this is because your editing timeline is set to the regular Rec. 709 color space. So now you have a few choices. The first option is to switch off Dolby Vision, and so now you record video in the regular Rec. 709 color space. In the record video settings, scroll down and you just toggle off HDR video. So the second option is to configure your editing timeline to work with Dolby Vision HDR video. And this means that you're setting your timeline to a Rec. 2020 color space. And then when you come to export this video, you do so in the same Rec. 2020 color space. And you're going to end up with a Dolby Vision HDR video. Now the third option is the same as the second option, but you export the video in a regular Rec. 709 color space. So why would we want to do that? And the reason would be that we now have this 10-bit color depth and when we come to color grading our videos. But we actually want to make the final video more compatible to platforms and other monitors that don't support HDR, so we convert it to Rec. 709. If you actually want to know whether a video clip was recorded in Dolby Vision, open your Photos gallery and you're going to see this HDR in the corner of any Dolby Vision video. So you can see that we might choose to record video in Dolby Vision even if we don't intend our final video to be in this format. And the reason to do so is for the extra color information for color grading. Your iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max can also record in Apple ProRes. To enable it, go to Camera Settings, choose Formats, scroll down to Apple ProRes and toggle it on. When you open the camera, you will find this ProRes option now. So you're going to need to then tap this to enable it when you want to shoot ProRes. So there's actually 3 different types of ProRes that you can select here. Back in Formats, when you toggle on Apple ProRes, this ProRes encoding option appears underneath. So you just tap that to bring up these 3 options, and you've got HDR, SDR and log. HDR is the Dolby Vision that we just talked about, so it's the Rec. 2020 color space. SDR is the standard dynamic range or the Rec. 709. And finally, there's Apple log. Now go back to the camera and you're going to see that the ProRes button is customized to whatever you selected in that ProRes encoding menu. If we selected SDR, but we also have Dolby Vision enabled, when we switch to ProRes, SDR is going to override that Dolby Vision. So this is a bit technical, but the file you get here is ProRes 422HQ, which stands for high quality, and that is a 10-bit color depth. And bear in mind that actually all ProRes video files are at least 10-bit color, so you're not going to get 8-bit versions of ProRes. So what's the catch? Well, the major downside is once again, you're going to get these huge files, just like with the raw photographs. We get the ProRes is sort of the similar thing, but for video. Apple log is new for the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max. So what you get is this washed out, flat looking video, which is actually not for viewing. It's a bit like, my analogy is that it's like a cake that doesn't have the icing on it. And what that does is to give you more flexibility when you want to change the look of it, but it means it's going to take more time to do so. And obviously more skill, like you need skill to decorate a cake. You also need skill to color grade log video. So again, this codec is really for those who want to spend time color grading their video. And if you want to go deeper, then take a look at my tutorial on Apple Log. And you can choose either the ad-free version on Patreon or on my channel here. On Patreon, you also get a text version, so it makes it easier to reference. And I'll leave a link in the description. By the way, you don't have to pay to become a member of my Patreon. There's actually a free option as well. And by joining my Patreon for free, you'll get my videos ad-free. And like I say, you're going to get this text version, which can sometimes be easier to reference. Plus, you'll get notified when I release new videos. When we are shooting video, it's quite natural to hold the phone in our fingers like this. But this is actually pretty unstable and you're more likely to get shaky footage. So most of the time we don't want shaky footage, and the easiest way to remove that is just to hold your iPhone more securely. So there's kind of different ways of doing this, but my method is just basically to hold my right hand flat against the back of the phone. And using this grip, it's still easy to move the camera around, but it's much more stable. To change cameras, just tap on the buttons by the record button. The 2 times is actually still the main camera, but it crops in. Remember at the start, I showed you can crop in by tapping the 1 times button in photo mode. So the 28mm gives you 1.2 times, the 35mm gives you 1.5 times zoom, and then the next step up is this 2 times button. And the 3 times button, or 5 times if you have the Pro Max, actually switches to the dedicated telephoto camera. And if you tap and hold on any of these buttons, it brings up a zoom wheel. And it tells you that the 2 times zoom is 48mm equivalent, and the 3 times is 77mm equivalent. Meanwhile, the ultra wide is 13mm equivalent. And so when I say equivalent, that just means that they're roughly the same as a regular camera lens with a comparable focal length. Now, of course, you can also pinch on the screen to zoom in and out. It's not the most accurate way to do it, so you might be better off either use the wheel or the buttons. The iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max have a number of options for inbuilt stabilization. Now, the regular iPhone stabilization is usually enough for most situations, but if you want extra smooth footage, or you're recording while you're running or something, then you can boost the stabilization, up a notch or 2. So in the record video menu, scroll down to enhanced stabilization, and this will give you more stable footage, but it's going to be at the cost of a loss of some pixels because it's going to crop in a little bit. Now open up your camera. There's a second option here called action mode. You see this button at the side, which kind of looks like a person running. Tap that to enable action mode. And you're going to see that the resolution is now limited to 2.8K. So again, we're sacrificing a bit of quality. When you switch to action mode, it automatically switches to the ultra wide camera. So it kind of compensates for that crop, but you're using the less quality sensor. But you can still switch to the main sensor if you want. Just tap the 1 button and it's still in action mode. Oh God, it's freezing. So back in the record video menu, below enhanced stabilization, you're going to find a setting called action mode lower light. And if you have this switched on, when you use action mode and there's not enough light, the phone is going to reduce the amount of stabilization, and instead it's going to retain more quality in the video. Now try moving your camera around and then pay attention to the color. Do you notice the color changing slightly? Like brown wood goes a little bit more bluish and things like that. Well, that's because white balance is changing automatically. And in most professionals, they're going to set white balance and then they're going to lock it because this looks kind of messy and unprofessional. And iPhones now have a setting which allow us to lock white balance. So the next thing we want to do is go into the record video menu, swipe down and switch on lock white balance. And this means that white balance is going to be set automatically, but as soon as we press record, the white balance setting is going to be locked. and that means it's not going to change during the shot. And when we stop recording, the iPhone starts up the auto white balance again, until, again, we press the record button and then it locks, and so on. You get the idea.
I'm waiting for a car to go past, because it's going to look cool. I've lined up the telegraph poles, and I just want a car to go across this road that goes right across this horizon, and it's freezing. I've seen loads of cars go past, but I just haven't got them. And now when I'm ready to take this shot, of course there's no cars. I'm just going to keep waiting. We've got to get this shot. Finally, that's worth it. I think it looks pretty cool. I got the telegraph wires sort of coming up into the top right. It creates this nice sort of perspective and depth to the image.
So this setting allows us to toggle on an auto frames per second feature. With this on, your video is going to be shot at 60 frames per second unless there isn't enough light, in which case it'll automatically switch to 30 frames per second. So for me, this is kind of what I would call a home movie setting. So it's okay if you don't want to think about frame rates, but personally I want to set my frame rates myself. Professionals will rarely, if ever, allow exposure to adjust automatically during a shot. Before you get a shot, think about locking exposure and focus. To do that, tap and hold on the subject in the frame until it locks. You're now going to have AE, AF lock written at the top, so that's auto exposure, auto focus, lock. And by the way, this will also lock white balance, so when we move the camera, we can see that nothing changes. And you can also use this slider again to adjust exposure. But just be aware that if your camera is moving, sometimes you do need focus to adjust during the shot. So I wouldn't say that it's a rule that you absolutely must lock focus and exposure for every shot. And if you would prefer to have locked exposure and white balance, but keep focus in auto, then you're going to need to use a camera app which allows manual control of each setting. For example, Filmic Pro or the new Blackmagic app. The iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max now have this setting which allows you to turn on a level meter. In the camera settings, below grid, we now have level. Switch this on and you get a little line in the middle of the screen which shows you if your camera is level. So you might have seen spirit levels on tripods or grips, because sometimes it's useful to know if your camera is level. So you might want to switch this on sometimes if it's important to you that the shot is level. In your iPhone camera settings, you can toggle on grid. Now, when you open the camera, you have 4 lines across the screen. And this grid helps you compose photos and videos by applying what's known as the rule of thirds. So what's the rule of thirds? Well, the rule of thirds is a kind of a simplification of the golden ratio. So what's the golden ratio? Artists and mathematicians saw the golden ratio in nature and then they applied it to their work. Because it seems that our minds are kind of hardwired to subconsciously recognize this ratio. And images that conform to it are said to look more beautiful than those that don't. And actually it's quite simple to use. You just place objects of interest at the intersection of the lines. You put your horizon here. Or you put it here. And you put people here. Or here. Frame your shot so their eyes are on or close to the top of the line. But by the way, you don't have to follow this rule. It's really just a guide to help you think about the way you frame your shots. Now, if you put objects in the center of the frame, they actually dominate it. And centered objects force us to look at them rather than contemplate the whole scene. Like when you're shooting a portrait. Using the grid just helps you prioritize which objects in the frame you want to be the most important. And of course it helps you make more beautiful images and hold the viewer's attention for longer.
temperature's risen a bit, so the snow is melting already. We've got a beautiful sky, and but yeah, it's kind of sad. The birds are happy though; they're out singing again. But the snow will be back. Everything in this video is shot with smartphones and a tripod. I haven't used any other kit, no filters or gimbals or anything. But if you want to learn how, you can join us on Patreon. Of course, we've got the free version as well, so it's a win-win really.